Okay, well, maybe we should get started now. So you're all very welcome to our second event on Ireland's COVID-19 crisis response, perspectives from the social scientists. You're currently in the session on EU dimensions of policy response. My name is Orla Doyle and I'm from the UC School of Economics, and I'm going to be chairing this session today. And I'm very pleased to welcome three of my former and my current colleagues as our panelists. We have Professor Brigid Laffan, the Director of the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies in EUI Florence. We have Professor Aidan Regan from the UC School of Political Science and International Relations. And finally, we have Professor Karl Whelan from the UC School of Economics. And the purpose of this conference is to discuss the likely implications and challenges which COVID-19 will have on our society, and to discuss how we as social scientists working with policymakers can contribute to finding solutions for these challenges. And in this particular session today, we're going to concentrate on the potential EU response. So just to start with some basic housekeeping, we are all new to using this type of technology to run conferences, so please bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. Note that the sessions are all being recorded and they're going to be available on publicpolicy.ie in the next couple of days. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to talk, and then that gives us lots of time for a Q&A session at the end. And everyone in the audience is welcome to post questions during the talks using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And in your question, please say to whom your question is being directed. And if you'd like, you can also include your own name and your own affiliation. And then in the Q&A session, I'll read out each of the questions as chair. So I think with that, we're ready to get started. And our first speaker today is Professor Brigid Laffan. Brigid, do you want to share your screen with the speakers or with the audience?
I think that has worked.
It has.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to engage with UCD, albeit remotely. It's quite a number of years now since I left UCD, but always wonderful to go back and to engage. Can I preface what I'm about to say with two observations? Firstly, that January is not that long ago, but in January, the EU had, with a new commission, the von der Leyen Commission, a very ambitious midterm agenda. Three major issues: the Green Deal, a new Green Deal, the economy and digitalization, and Europe's place in the world. And at that stage, the EU, both the European Council and the Commission and the Parliament, all of these collective institutions felt that they were now launched on medium-term issues when suddenly, from afar, COVID-19 simply swept the agenda away. But that agenda, those issues remain on the table and will be part of, in my view, any longer-term response. The second observation I would make is that given the deep interdependence in Europe, both economic but also political and social, regardless of whether the EU has capacity or regardless of whether it can agree, there is an expectation that Europe will respond. There's an expectation of action and there's an expectation of solidarity. And that, in a sense, in other words, we have to not just think of what the EU legally can do, but also what the expectations are of what it should do. In my talk, it's not, my slides don't want to move somehow or other. I want to focus on four things. Firstly, I think it's worth us paying some attention to why every crisis the EU has, the challenges it faces, if they're deep, are usually framed in existential terms, in a way that one doesn't talk about the US or China, but for the EU, crisis and an existential element seem to go hand in hand. Because I know what Aidan and Karl will focus on, I will look at the health response, and then I will also, but this will be developed by the other speakers, I will look at why fiscal is the battleground, and finally, what would a virtuous policy cycle look like? And I think we should devote some attention to what is the best the EU can do given all of the constraints. So firstly, on why is every EU crisis framed as existential? I'm very struck, both political actors, media, but also social scientists use a language of make or break. I've given two examples here of the Italian Prime Minister Conte, Europe facing its its appointment with history, and the risk of failure is real. Macron, in his FT interview, the European Union is facing a moment of truth. But this is the language that is used not just by political actors, but also by social scientists. And we've had a lot of discussion of will this lead to the collapse of the EU, the unraveling of the EU, the disintegration. And I would argue that there are three reasons why the existential always enters the debate. Firstly, that the EU as a polity or form of political order is much less robust than deeply institutionalized, deeply rooted states. So it's a relatively young political construct. It has much weaker public power than nation states have. In other words, it relies a lot on law for public power, but has very little financial or at least budgetary power. And it doesn't have the same effective ties of community that one finds within the member states. But the second reason is that the language of make or break is instrumentalized. It's used by political actors to signal urgency and to get their favored political outcomes. It's not accidental that Macron is using this crisis, because he has had a project for the development of the EU that he has found difficult to get traction with. And he now sees this COVID-19 as a very important opportunity for the kind of Europe that he wants. And then finally, it's important to acknowledge that the Eurozone remains a vulnerable and possibly fragile project. In terms of COVID-19 itself, it was a symmetric shock. It was an exogenous shock. It can't be, there is no one member state caused this, but it has had a really significant differential impact on the member states, particularly in terms of timing. Italy was the first. It was caught unawares, despite the fact that perhaps it shouldn't have been, but I would say that for all of the member states. And it was it really experienced, in its richest region, it experienced an extraordinary downturn, both in terms of the capacity of its health system, but also its economy. So the number of cases and deaths. And I would argue that Italy, and I know Italy better than Spain, I think we're dealing with a country that's experienced a trauma, that it's not just an economic, social and political crisis, but there is a need for that society to be able to lift itself up after this. There were also, given that this crisis needed public power, there were different starting points in terms of margin, given debt levels and deficit levels. And finally, and I think we have to acknowledge, and it was important that von der Leyen apologized to Italy, that when the Italians activated the EU mechanism of civil protection, which is a mechanism that was established to deal with natural disasters, earthquakes, extreme weather conditions, but the Italians did activate it in early March on COVID-19. And for the first time in the history of the EU, not a single member state responded. And that's exceptional. There are reasons for this. I don't think it was deliberate, but that really does contextualize what's happening in Italy in terms of this crisis. Moving to the health response, the EU has extremely limited legal and constitutional competence in relation to health. The EU has a hierarchy of competence, and health is the weakest of those. So the delivery and design of public health responses are national. The EU can complement national policy, but that's the weakest. It's not exclusive to the EU, it's not shared. Most EU competences are shared, very few are exclusive and very few are complementary. But this is an extremely weak treaty basis for action in this field. So life and death remains national. And so one has to keep that in mind in terms of the EU response in terms of the health dimension of COVID-19. That said, the EU did create in the early 2000s, after SARS, it created, as part of the development of a lot of agencies at EU level, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, based in Stockholm. That agency is a coordinating agency. It's much weaker than, say, the Medicines Agency or others. That said, it had a very bad early COVID-19 crisis. It was saying as well into January that the EU was well prepared to identify and treat patients. And its only caveat was that they weren't sure about the data coming out of China. But they have upped their game since then. But if this Centre for Disease Prevention and Control was created in order to help with anticipating pandemics and helping the response, then I think there are questions that will have to be answered. And I think you will get a learning from this in the ECDC, because it's clear that COVID-19 was seeding through Europe, not just in Italy in January already. It was coming through Germany and onwards into Italy through the airports, because the Italians were among the earliest to close flights to China. There was broadly, I would say, and I would say this of both the member states and the EU as a collective, that there was a failure to grasp the urgency of what was happening until early March. It was seen as an Italian problem, and the rest of Europe was low risk. But as the member states themselves woke up to the risk, they suddenly realized that they weren't prepared in terms of PPE, testing and ICU capacity. And part of the reason there wasn't a response to Italy in early March was all of the governments were frantically trying to establish what their capacity was at domestic level and weren't prepared to help the Italians at that stage. There was also, in early March, France and Germany in particular used the emergency provisions in European law to limit export of certain medical equipment. They had the right to do it legally, but it was really damaging. The Commission intervened very quickly and tried again to they rolled back on most of it. But there was the instinct of the governments of the EU was, we protect our own first. There was a national response, and one could even argue a nationalistic response in this early phase. The Commission did move in as quickly as it could when it realized what was happening. There was also, of course, a lot of ad hoc border closures. Schengen, one country after another began to use the emergency provisions on Schengen. And so again, the Commission had a very important role to put structure around this, to make sure that this did not prevent the free flow of goods, and to make sure that essential workers could travel. The green lanes, when they really worked with the member states to get down, to reduce the problems on the borders. So there was the role that the Commission, in terms of its role in maintaining European law on the single market, was important in both these instances. It launched the public procurement drive to build up stockpiles of necessary equipment. It was engaged very actively with the member states in the repatriation of EU citizens from across the world. It activated Horizon 2020 on research as quickly, in other words, as quickly as it could, both on the health side, but also on the social science side. And there will be, and this is something I think Irish social scientists universities should think about, is how they want to participate in the calls that will come on COVID-19 in the social sciences, because I think the life sciences and the medical clinical researchers are already very active, but it's really important that social science is there as well. And of course, the Commission began the process of giving guidance on what an exit strategy might look like. Again, the member states will respond in their, the decision to exit and the manner of exit will be national, but unless it's coordinated across the member states, there is very real danger of the re-emergence of second waves and all of that. So the public health side, the EU had limited competence, did activate whatever competence it had pretty quickly. I would argue that in the next phase of the EU's development in terms of a discussion on treaty change, I would expect not that the health competence of the EU will be strengthened, but its competence in relation to transnational pandemics will. In other words, there will be a strengthening of the legal basis, and I think there will be a lot of other action in terms of crisis preparation, in terms of stockpiling of essential medicines, etc., etc. So I think this crisis will lead to more EU in the next phase of the development of the European Union. But of course, where the EU has a vital role to play is the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, and particularly on the single market and the Eurozone. And I'm very struck in the last week, in the early phase of the crisis, and I lose track of time in weeks now, but there was a lot of concentration on the Eurozone. But I'm very struck now that most of what the EU is doing, that it is the language of the single market and the language of a level playing field. In other words, that in order to maintain the single market, that the recovery must be balanced across Europe. And in some ways, because there will have to be a discussion on the and particular policy instruments for the Eurozone, but I think it really matters that that the focus is on the single market as well, again, given international developments. So in terms of the economic response, and I'm very conscious that I will be followed both by a political economist and an economist, so I'm not going to say too much on this. But I think we have to acknowledge that this was the biggest display of public state power in Europe in a very long time. And I think that there will be a legacy of this in terms of state market balances and what states and what public power looks like in the next phase. Clearly, Karl will talk about the ECB, so I won't, other than to say that the ECB, if one remembers Lagarde's unfortunate statement about not being responsible for reducing spreads, I think that was a very well-timed error. Why? Because it meant that when pressure came on for an ECB response, it really had to be big. And I think they delivered on that. The other thing that I'm struck by is the speed with which both the state aid rules and also the Growth and Stability Pact, that the EU bent, because the EU is a creature formed by rules, the speed with which it was understood that rules really had to go and that discretion really mattered in this context. But then we're left with the fiscal and the fiscal response. And I'm not at all surprised at the level of contestation and the level of conflict there is about what the fiscal response of the EU should be. Why? Because it has always been one of the most contested and conflictual issues in the history of the EU. Budgetary power in the EU has remained extraordinarily constrained for a very long time. The budget itself, about 1% of GNI. And redistribution is by definition a very contested issue in all political systems, but particularly one that is a hybrid union of states and union of peoples. I also, though, want to emphasize that at every major development, every important step development in European integration, there has been a redistributive or distributive element. In other words, the original Rome Treaty with Common Agricultural Policy and the Social Fund, the single market with cohesion. On the other hand, what has never been conceded is what the Germans call the transfer union. In other words, permanent interregional transfers. So I'm not at all surprised at the level of conflict, the level of contestation, and the struggle the system is having on the fiscal side. The battleground, I think, in this area, I think it's most unfortunate that in the early phase, and by that I mean a couple of weeks ago in the Euro group, that there was, that the lens and legacy of the Eurozone crisis, the North-South, the creditor-debtor, the pigs versus the frugal, re-emerged in the Eurozone in a very powerful way. And there was the sorts of language used by the Dutch finance minister, but also the response to him was very trenchant and very quick. But we also know that the Eurozone has struggled to complete banking union. And so what I would like to ask both Aidan and Karl is, what are the most effective EU instruments that can be constructed that might be politically feasible? In other words, not what is the optimal, but what actually will make the difference so that there is the least economic damage to Europe at the least political cost, at the lowest political cost. And I think we have now, the European Council yesterday they did agree to what the Euro group had come up with, SURE, EIB and ESM. And now the focus is on the MFF and a recovery fund. I think Corona bonds will not, they're gone. It has to be, so in other words, what is the nearest equivalent to Corona bonds that are not Corona bonds that the system can agree to? And I'm not going to talk about the European Council yesterday, other than to say that it really matters that the responsibility has been passed to the Commission rather than back to the Eurogroup. And I think that's a recognition that the Eurogroup had run out of steam and that it now needs the Commission. Now, what will the Commission do? What can it come up with? And how can it work with the member states in order to come up with a recovery fund that will make a difference? And finally, I think it's really important to think about how fragile domestic politics are in Europe at the moment. And I just give you two countries. It's in the interests of all of the member states that they deal with this government in Italy and that it survives for as long as possible. Because it is, regardless of how difficult it is to get agreement now, a Salvini-led government would be a very different proposition in my view. And so the problem for Italy at the moment is that you have a very unstable coalition with very different attitudes to the EU. The PDs are critical but broadly supportive. The Cinque Stelle are not. And in Italy, the ESM has become a bête noire. And in January, we were actually wanting to do something on the ESM in February to probe why it was so problematic in Italy. And when I looked at the data, 60% of Italians knew nothing about it. Only 6% understood what the ESM was, but that doesn't matter. It really, in the public discourse, is very difficult for Conte to think about using the ESM. Although I think if there is a recovery fund, interestingly, I think they may use it as well. On the other hand, back to our friends, the Dutch. So the Dutch have an election on the 21st of March next year. We shouldn't forget that it took them over 200 days to construct this government, and that their finance minister, Hoekstra, would like to replace Rutte. So there's a very strong domestic competitive element to how the Dutch will respond. So there's their instinct that they don't like redistribution anyway, which I find, given the Netherlands is an entrepot state, all of its economy is based on being the entrepot for the whole of Europe. the way in which their finance ministry has dominated this debate in the Netherlands is extraordinary. But that's neither here nor there. The Dutch are where the Dutch are, and it will require, and I had a slide on the virtuous cycle, but I'm out of time. But the other important development, in my view, is that although France is on one side of the debate and Germany is on the other, the French and Germans are working more closely on this than at any stage over the last 3 years. And that's really good, because unless we get a Franco-German arrangement that the others can find their policy space in, this will go nowhere. And it's also important that Germany is not one of the frugal four at this stage. In other words, the northern frugal group are reduced in size in this crisis, and that's a good thing. So I think I'll leave it there because I've run out of time, but we can come back to the virtuous cycle afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brigid. That was incredibly informative and interesting, and it raises some really interesting questions for the rest of the panel. I'd just like to remind all of the audience out there that you can post questions to our panelists using the Q&A session, using the Q&A function at the end. But now we're going to move on to our second speaker, who is Aidan Regan from the UC School of Political Science and International Relations. So Aidan, if you'd like to share your screen.
Yeah. Should be shared there. Can you see it okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thank you, Orla, for chairing this session. Thank you, Brigid, for providing that really interesting context and lots of questions, and poses lots of interesting dilemmas going forward. And thanks to all the audience and to Liam and Stephen for organizing this session. So the title of my presentation is Priests and Sinners, the Euro Framing of the COVID Crises. And I apologize in advance for the text-heavy slides that I'm going to use. They're more for kind of framing and shaping my own thoughts and structuring my own thinking on this. But there's really three dimensions or three steps to the argument I want to present to you today. And the first one is to put forth the claim or the argument that the core problem of the Eurozone, I think, is economic polarization. I think the Euro is growing further apart because it has unequal and very imbalanced growth models. And this divergence between very different growth models is likely to be exacerbated by the cost of paying for the COVID-19 crisis. However, the structure of these unequal economies, unequal growth models, different varieties of capitalism, if you like, are increasingly framed as a morality tale. And I think the intergovernmental method that governs decision-making within the Eurozone amplifies this morality tale. As Brigid has already alluded to, nationalist politics in the Eurogroup is increasingly focused on domestic public opinion. And this narrative pits the prudent and responsible North against the spendthrift, irresponsible South. And in turn, I think this narrative gives asymmetric bargaining power to those with more fiscal capacity in responding to this crisis and also the Euro crisis previously, which I refer to in this presentation as the high priests of the Eurozone. The third step here, I will argue, is that the need for a common Euro response, I think, is obvious. And I think most scholars, most observers would agree that a common response is required. But it seems to me that the only actor really capable of this common response is the European Central Bank. And the ECB, I think, is the only thing really keeping the Eurozone together. However, the actions and the interventions of the ECB, despite being necessary, arguably creates a reverse moral hazard in that it allows the high priest to continue to pontificate without internalizing the actual cost of the Euro area growing more and more unequal and growing further and further apart. And therefore, they don't have to internalize the political polarization that's generated. So back to the first step here. Economic polarization in the Eurozone. In the study of comparative and international political economy, the research tradition or community that I would be engaged with, it is widely accepted that the Euro area contains qualitatively distinct regional varieties of capitalism and distinct growth regimes. for heuristic purposes or for stylized purposes, you can imagine this in terms of export-oriented growth models in the north of Europe. But within that cluster of countries, you have countries that specialize more in manufacturing, price-sensitive manufacturing, to a certain extent Germany, but also export-led economies that have relatively large public sectors and large public service, health and education in particular, in the Scandinavian countries. You also have a cluster of countries that depend heavily on foreign direct investment to generate economic growth. And Ireland and Eastern and Central Europe will be very much part of this cluster of countries, albeit attracting investment from two very different regions of the world. Ireland closely connected transatlantically to the United States, Eastern Central Europe very closely connected to the supply chains of Germany and its other satellite states, so to speak. But you also have a very strong cluster of demand-led or consumption-oriented growth models in the south of Europe. And it is this cluster of growth regimes that seems to have most difficulty adapting to the constraints of the Eurozone for fairly obvious reasons, which I will outline in a moment. Now, these are stylized assumptions. All countries obviously have domestic and export-led sectors, but small countries, and Germany arguably is the large country with a small open economy mentality, typically depend much more on key export firms and sectors for growth. Typically, and what we see increasingly across the international political economy, is that all countries tend to have higher growth cities, metropolitan areas, in terms of Barcelona, Milan, Paris, Amsterdam, Dublin. And this, of course, creates its own regional dynamics within the Euro area. But Southern European countries, and I'm thinking here in terms of France, Italy, Spain in particular, have very large internal domestic markets. The vast majority of small and micro businesses within these countries are focused on these markets. These firms and businesses account for 90% plus of employment within these countries, and domestic demand and relatively high levels of consumption is key for economic growth within these countries. And the question is, well, how do you generate that consumption, either through wages, government spending, is crucial for understanding, I think, the politics of the Euro area and the question of debt-led growth. Now, Germany, I think in particular, and also the smaller export economies of Northern Europe, typically imagine the Eurozone as though it were a small, open exporting economy. And I think this is a crucial problem. Because for the high priests of Northern Europe, and for the Eurozone in particular, an economy built on domestic consumption is morally inferior. And the question, where does that sense that domestic-led or consumption-led growth being morally inferior come from, is a very open question, but one worth posing. The damning legacy of the Euro crisis. Now, the different developmental trajectories of Eurozone countries has led to institutionally distinct growth regimes and institutionally distinct labor markets, occupational structures, higher educational regimes, training regimes, vocational training regimes, social insurance and social protection regimes. And again, for those who are familiar with the research of comparative political economy, this is the classic debate on different varieties of capitalism, different institutional structures, which are qualitatively distinct. The EU policy response to the Euro crisis, however, politicized these qualitative differences. The high priests of Europe commanded, if you like, a convergence, and convergence is the key word here, with a one-size-fits-all fiscal regime. And the objective here was to encourage an export-oriented growth regime for all member states of the Euro. And this export-led growth regime was to be complemented with strict adherence to fiscal and economic governance rules. To promote export-oriented growth, debtor and deficit countries were effectively penanced with implementing what became known as supply-side structural reforms, which really translates into fiscal austerity, labor market liberalization, and in turn weakening the public sectors, in particular of these countries, in health and education. Now, unsurprisingly, the recipe for promoting export-led growth during the Euro crisis did not work. Even Marco Butti, the chief economist, or the previous chief economist of the European Commission, has admitted as such. Because in order to generate the conditions for high-tech export-led growth would probably require decades of public investment in health and education in particular, and arguably a new state-led industrial policy which would go beyond and perhaps break the rules of the single market. The implication, however, of this instruction sheet, this recipe, was to effectively cripple domestic demand and domestic consumption in these particular political economies that are much more reliant on domestic demand vis-a-vis their northern neighbours. Moral tales in the Eurozone. So southern European countries entered the COVID-19 crisis with much less fiscal capacity. The source of this problem, though, was a decade of weak economic growth. And the question I think that needs to be asked is, why have these countries struggled to generate growth? And I think I have alluded to why that is the case a moment ago. But from the high priest perspective, the source of weak growth in Southern Europe is that they did not complete their penance. They did not follow the fiscal and economic governance rules of the Eurozone. As Jerome Dijsselbloem alluded to in 2017, apparently these countries spent all their money on women and booze, notwithstanding the implicit racism and sexism of this statement. In practice, I would argue that the more these countries followed the fiscal rules, the more they tightened their fiscal belts, the more they undermined the political and institutional conditions for growth within their particular countries. Italy, Spain, France have very large internal markets with lots of intra-regional performance. So of course, in Northern Italy, you have a cluster of high-tech export growth around Milan. You could say the same around Barcelona and so on. So there's lots of intra-regional differences, but fundamentally, from a broader perspective, domestic consumption is key to lifting economic growth in these countries, generating revenue, and therefore the ability to pay off the debt and so forth. Furthermore, it is worth noting that the countries with the highest levels of household debt in Europe are the Scandinavian countries. The Netherlands have the highest level of household debt in Europe. So I'm not sure I would consider these countries to be frugal. They also have the largest public sectors. They spend more than most other countries in the Eurozone. Also, Italy has ran a primary fiscal surplus for over 20 years. The cost of servicing its debt from the 70s and 80s is really what generates a lot of the constraints within its budget, but it has ran a primary budget surplus for 20 years. Arguably, that's a problem. Now, the effect of cultural narratives on policy responses and policy making is not easy to test empirically, and there's a research project in that, I think. But it seems to me that they have become a cognitive shortcut for explaining structurally very different political economies and adding a normative dimension, if you like, to that. The Church of the Eurogroup. Now, these narratives and myths initially framed, and I think are continuing to frame, the intergovernmental response to the crises. And in turn, as Brigid has already suggested, this is deepening the distrust between countries and between national electorates. The national interest-based politics of the Eurogroup, which in a sense is the closest thing the Euro area has to an economics ministry or a finance ministry, amplifies the morality tale. It's worth noting that the Eurogroup does not keep minutes and it has no formal legislative legitimacy, but it does shape and it does frame the policy debate for the European Council. And it is worth noting, as Brigid said, that the Council have kicked the decision-making over to the European Commission rather than back to the Eurogroup. But this intergovernmental nature of decision-making amongst these finance ministers ultimately means that national politicians think much more about their party interests and national media, domestic public opinion. And party interests tend to be focused on maintaining their core electoral base within their particular countries. And if there's an election upcoming, as there is in the Netherlands, and there's rising Eurosceptic sentiment within a particular country, pressure is put on centre-right Christian democratic politicians to be seen to be acting tough vis-a-vis the sinners in the south. And I don't think this helps at all in terms of the problem-solving perspective of the Euro area. The outcome of all of this is an asymmetry of bargaining power that clearly favours the stronger economies and those with more fiscal capacity within the Eurozone. But it is worth asking the question, at what cost? Because as Catherine de Vries has argued at the Bocconi Institute, the Dutch are behaving more like high priests than merchants. It's not in the long-term strategic interest of these countries to continue to moralize and pontificate about certain structural problems that really have nothing to do with culture or morality. Now, it seems to me that Ireland realized that this was the case and acted much more pragmatically and strategically, in the sense of don't throw stones in glass houses, particularly when other countries perceive you as being a tax haven. Moralizing against your own interest, penance-ing your Euro neighbours with more national debt, and restricting their ability to recover from this crisis is not in anybody's self-interest. It's not in any Eurozone country's self-interest. It will simply deepen the economic divide between very different regions of the Euro. It seems to me that in order to really reduce the divergence in economic performance between countries of the Euro area, those larger demand-led or consumption-oriented countries need to be given much more flexibility to generate their own economic growth models and pursue their own developmental paths. Arguably, this means permanently changing the EU state aid rules and permanently changing the Euro fiscal rules. That permanent change, however, is unlikely. But at least in the medium to short term, creating the space for more fiscal investment, long-term strategic investment, would be very welcome. But it does beg a difficult question, which I think has been avoided for a very long time, which is, can diverse regional varieties of capitalism coexist within the rules and constraints of the single currency? And at what point does strict adherence to traditional rules and norms effectively risk bringing down the entire church? The savior of the ECB, it seems to me that the ECB has effectively postponed this question again. And Karl will talk in more detail now about the ECB. But it seems to me that the PEP, the Pandemic Emergency Bond Buying Programme, has bought time for member states of the Euro area. It has arguably made the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, broadly irrelevant for the moment. It has made the cost of national borrowing more affordable for the moment, and let's see how that pans out. Again, Italy being slightly different in this context. But the political problem remains, and the political problem is whether the cost of the recovery and investing in the recovery should be nationalized or Europeanized. The one European dimension to this would be, of course, creating a shared debt instrument, a common shared debt instrument, Corona bonds. That seems to be ruled out at the moment. A second common Europeanized response would be generating some sort of, let's call it, shared spending instrument, whereby the EU would create perpetual debt or enter into the markets, generate, let's say, funding. And then the question would be whether or not this should be issued out in the form of grants or loans to member states. Now, it seems that the high priests of Europe are completely opposed to the first option, having a common debt instrument, and they seem to have won that debate. That seems to be taken off the table. But the question then is whether they will accept a common spending instrument. If they do accept a common spending instrument, and that does imply the EU generating some sort of debt to a perpetual bond, let's say, will they accept that that's issued to member states in the form of grants or loans? And the response last night seems to be, well, we don't know, but at least the indications from the Austrian Prime Minister on Twitter anyway was that the idea of grants are completely off the table. Germany has also seemed to suggest that grants are off the table. That would suggest to me that the national-based response prevails. And I think this will deepen the already existing deep economic polarization between and within member states. But as long as the ECB keeps the taps running in some shape or form, the high priest can continue to pontificate in the sense that they don't need to internalize the real risk of a euro breakup, because the ECB arguably will stop that from happening. And they don't need to internalize the cost of the Eurozone growing more and more unequal, which is in nobody's long-term strategic interests. To conclude, it is not in anyone's interest to see the Euro area grow more and more unequal. The reasons for the deep and structural economic polarization are far more complex than a morality tale. If member states are really serious about convergence, that is, converging in terms of income levels, standards of living, each member state needs to be able to invest equally. And that, in a sense, poses difficult questions about the rules of the euro and the rules of the single market, because not all countries are equal. what we have is a very unequal Europe. But those who have economically benefited the most from the euro, and arguably those who have most to lose from the euro, I'm thinking here about Germany in particular, have a real political responsibility to explain that to their domestic electorate and media. That might be slightly naive, but it seems to me that perhaps, however, this realization seems to be emerging within Germany. And there appears to be, I could be wrong on this, a slight shift or change taking place within the CDU-SPD coalition in Germany. Germany seems to realize that it will not be able to export its way out of this particular crisis, and that actually it will need stronger economic growth domestically within the euro area. And there also seems to be a growing realization that Matteo Salvini and the La Lega in Italy are a far bigger threat to the euro than the competitors they have domestically in the form of alternative for Deutschland. But for the moment, it seems to me that the only actor holding everything together is the ECB. And that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan. That was incredibly interesting. And also, I think it'll be interesting now to hear Karl's response to some of this as well. So, Karl, if you would like to come on board and share your screen. Okay, I can see your screen. Yeah, now it's working.
Okay. Now, can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So, thanks to Liam and Stephen for putting this together, for Orla for chairing. I think it's a nice complementary group of people to have, because I'm going to talk about some slightly different things than Brigid and Aidan, but it will feed quite well into the themes, the issues that they raise, the broader issues that they raised. So I'm a former central banker and still very involved in lots of ways in the world of central banking. So I will mainly talk about the ECB, and then I have an if time bit to address this issue of using the ESM as opposed to, for instance, Corona bonds. And I could do an hour presentation on that. So I've just got a bunch of bullet points on that. Maybe that's an issue we might come back and talk more about if I run out of time here. So I'm mainly going to talk about the ECB, and I'm going to talk about some of the sort of wilder and more exceptional things that are being discussed because, well, because these are wild and exceptional times. And I want to start by just, making an obvious point about why the ECB is so crucial in the current crisis. There's an alphabet soup of different organizations involved in coping with this crisis. You've got the EU and all its commission, the ESM, the EIB, you've got the national governments. And a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of the politicking is about who bears the burden of having to borrow the money and who receives the money. And it's all zero sum. So the ECB, on the other hand, is a unique institution because the ECB is the only institution in the European Union that can create money from nowhere. The ECB does not have to borrow the money. They just make it up. And that's an enormous power. So in a way, we shouldn't be surprised that the ECB has the ability to play a key role. And I am more optimistic that we can get through this crisis and that indeed, to use the infamous words, that this time is different might actually be true, and that the ECB's actions can allow us to get through this crisis with less financial instability and less austerity during a recovery phase. So let me talk a little bit about what I'm going to say the rest of the way. Monetary policy in exceptional times. So in a way, we were already in exceptional times before the COVID-19 crisis had hit. Because the normal way the central banks deal with the economy going into recession is, they cut interest rates. But the ECB's policy rate was already, the effective policy rate that matters was already negative, and probably about at the lower limit that it's possible to have. People used to think there was a zero bound on interest rates. And the logic was, well, for instance, if the central bank charged banks to keep their money at on deposit, they would just take them out and keep them as cash. Now it turns out the amount that's kept in the amount that large banks keep on reserve is so large that they don't want to keep the money in a warehouse somewhere or have to pay for security and so on. So indeed, banks are willing to pay money to the ECB to store their cash, but there's likely to be a lower limit to that. You start charging them 3% or something, they'll just take the money out. So the normal tool is sort of almost exhausted. You can encourage banks to lend and have various credit programs. The ECB has been doing that for a long time. But during this particular crisis, banks might be reluctant to lend to businesses and households, given all the uncertainty and given default risk. You can use the old unconventional measures, right? So quantitative easing, you do asset purchases, and ECB was already doing that, but they've obviously stepped up in a major way. But it looks a little bit like more of the same. So you can kind of see why people are saying, well, what we need now are more exceptional measures. So I'm going to talk about the idea of monetary financing. I'm going to talk about whether or not the ECB can prevent austerity, and I'm going to talk about helicopter money. And I'm going to give spoiler alerts as to what my answers are. It's whether we can do this. Monetary financing of government. Can we do it? No / sort of. Preventing austerity during the recovery? Probably. Helicopter money? Maybe / sort of. Okay. Sorry, I can't be more definitive. Okay. So here's can the ECB finance government spending? So here's the no. Article 123 of the treaty genuinely says, well, here's the interesting thing. Article 123 doesn't actually specifically state that central banks can't hand money directly over. This is one of these things that the founding fathers of the euro were very familiar with monetary financing in the sense of central banks purchasing bonds from governments and financing them that way. They hadn't really thought of that they would literally just print the money off and give it to the government and then say, see ya, it's all yours. So technically, Article 123 just outlaws direct financing in the form of loans or overdrafts. But this is one of these issues that if they outlaw that, then you can be sure that they thought it was illegal for central banks to just give money to governments. So I'm sure the ECB lawyers will tell the, how do these things get decided as legal or not? Well, the ECJ sit and say, well, what was intended? What did the founding fathers intend by these articles? And you can be sure that they intended by these articles that direct monetary financing was to be illegal. So, so that's not going to happen. Okay, why did I say maybe? Well, one reason I say maybe is there's been this debate about QE since it started. Is QE sort of like monetary financing? Does QE really make it easier to run large budget deficits? And for many years, the conventional answer in the central banking community, and this is what I would have said to some extent as well, was no, it's not monetary financing, and no, it doesn't make it easier to run large deficits. These are just secondary market purchases, so somebody else has to be willing to loan money to the government, and then the ECB can come in and purchase these in the secondary market. And then the plan is always, was always that when the bonds matured, then the government would have to pay the central bank the money, and then the central bank, we'd be back at normal times again, and the central bank would then shrink its balance sheet. So in the end, it's not monetary financing. The government has to pay the money back to the central bank, and the money created disappears. But now that we've had QE for, at least since the last crisis in many countries, and going before then in Japan, you're starting to see signs of what actually happens. And what actually happens is the central banks have not really sold off much of the debt. So for instance, if you look at Japan, Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of 200%. Like, wow, that must be completely unsustainable. There's going to be a sovereign default in Japan. Well, 90% of that 200% is owned by the Bank of Japan. And there's no sign the Bank of Japan is going to reduce its holdings. And so, what that means is that all of the interest payments that the Japanese government makes to Bank of Japan, they just become profits for the Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan recycles them back. So the net debt ratio is effectively 110%. And of course, the Bank of Japan keeps interest rates on the debt very, very low. So similar things happened with the Federal Reserve. I'll show you a chart in a second. Federal Reserve bought lots of Treasury securities, sold some of them off but now has started buying them again. So in effect, a lot of QE debt has ended up being monetized, and there might be a point in the future where that's reversed. But I think in the euro area, we're very, very likely to end up in a situation where the euro system owns very, very large amounts of public debt for a very long time. Okay, there's that chart. So that makes, you know, the intervention of the ECB and the involvement of the euro system means that our conventional ideas of what is sustainable in terms of debt get turned on their head a little bit. So, you know, these large QE programs make fiscal debt sustainable for two reasons. The one I just mentioned, which is basically the net debt owed to the private sector is lower, but it also lowers the interest rates. So, like, let's talk about the country that most people think is the next possible sovereign default. That's Italy. Italy's debt GDP ratio in 2019 was 136%. Like, wow, that sounds really high. But on the other hand, Italy only paid 3.5% of its GDP in interest payments on that debt, which is actually very low by historical standards for Italy. And 1/6 of those interest payments went to the Bank d'Italia, who then recycled most of it back. So it's actually in effect lower than that. So even if we imagine that Italy has to increase its debt GDP ratio by 20 points, 30 points, this doesn't look like a situation that has to be unsustainable. And that's crucial. The intervention of the ECB and the involvement in the ECB is crucial to sustaining that. And I think to summarize that this time is different, I think that Italy in 2021 doesn't have to be the same as Greece in 2011. If you look at the EL for Greece, you can see that prior to the financial crisis, Greece was paying about 4.5% of its GDP in interest. That rapidly ramped up to 7.5%, and it did so because of the factors that I'm describing that are supporting Italy now were not in place. There wasn't a QE program supporting Greece. And people knew the Greeks were on their own. And the only thing that led to a decline in the interest payments then was a debt restructuring. The interest rates on the debt start to go up and up and up, and it becomes self-fulfilling. Given where Italy is now and given the support of the ECB, I don't think we need to have to be having that discussion now. I'm going to say something a bit, I want to keep myself to things that I think are legal. But I'm going to then say some things that are kind of heterodox, okay, in the central banking community. I'm going to point out that there is an alternative way that the Eurosystem central banks could make transfers to the government. Because there is this whole thing of central banks are very independent. There's this huge Chinese wall between central banks and government. But ultimately, central banks are public bodies. Right? And when central banks make profits, central banks hand those profits, most of them anyway, back to the government. But it actually turns out that a large amount of the profits that the Eurosystem has made in the past have not been transferred. They've been retained. And these profits, a lot of these profits have come under the heading of what they call revaluation accounts. Okay, this is like super nerdy, but basically when the Eurosystem calculates its profit and loss account, when their assets go up in value, it just sort of says, ooh, we don't want to admit that that's happened. Let's just, so what they do is they admit the assets have gone up in value, but then they invent a fictitious liability on the liability side called revaluation accounts. So because, and this is what this thing quote from the ECB says, well, they might go down again in value afterwards, right? So how big is this thing? 507 billion big, which is 4% of euro area GDP. So that is basically an accounting principle for how the Eurosystem operates. And it doesn't have to operate that way. So, you know, the Eurosystem could say, we're changing our accounting principles for this year. And suddenly we've made profits of 507 billion in 2020, and we're transferring that back. Coincidentally, the Eurosystem also owns 509 billion in gold, which has no practical usage whatsoever in implementing monetary policy. It has no practical usage whatsoever anyway, right? So this would be the sort of radical proposal, but the Eurosystem decides to sell its gold and return the proceeds to national governments. What the hell are they doing sitting on gold with 4% of GDP anyway? And there's nothing about the Eurosystem's operational ability to meet its targets that would be compromised by this. So anyway, there's one way, I think perfectly legally, that you could have a large once-off transfer from the euro system to fiscal treasuries. Now, I think this is legal, but I suspect these guys wouldn't like it, okay? But the ECB has shown in the past it's willing to do things that these guys don't like, and the ECJ tends to be a bit more sympathetic to what the ECB wants than these guys. Okay, helicopter money. This is the other thing people are talking about. Okay, maybe it's illegal to give money to governments, but what about we just go around the governments and we give money to people directly? The central bank just puts money in people's bank accounts. Now, again, the founding fathers didn't really think much about this. It's not clear that this is illegal. What the central bankers will say is that, well, the way we do this will all end up in people's bank accounts, and people's bank accounts will, the commercial banks that they have will come to us looking for the, to fulfill our obligations. And so this will increase the notional liabilities of the central bank. The central bank will have these extra liabilities, which is the deposits that commercial banks have with them. These liabilities, by the way, now make money for the ECB, right? Because they charge banks for this, because the deposit rate is negative. But notionally, it'd be listed as a liability. And does that matter? No, that doesn't matter. Central banks can carry on whatever their value of their assets and liabilities are. But this is an issue that there's a lot of dogma about, including within the ECB. There are people within the ECB who think that to implement monetary policy, their assets have to exceed liabilities by some amount. They're wrong, but they exist. So I don't see the ECB being too keen on doing helicopter money. But how would they do it in practice? Some of the practical things are quite difficult, right? So they don't have information on everybody's bank account. Like if they had to go to the government to say, can you give us information on everybody's bank account? Maybe that looks a lot to some like a monetary financed tax cut. If you were looking for PPS numbers or things like that, it looks like some kind of government finance program. But Eric Lonergan, who's an Irish guy, runs a hedge fund in London. Eric argues that in a sense, helicopter money does already exist in one form. Banks can, under certain conditions right now, borrow from the ECB at negative rates. So in other words, a bank could borrow 100 million and then pay back 99 and make the other, the million that they made in the profit, because it's a negative interest rate loan. Where did that come from? It's helicopter money, right? They selected this bank and they said, there's $1 million for you. So, you could argue if helicopter money is good enough for banks, maybe it's good enough for people. You look at all these businesses now that are suffering, maybe you could do something like this. ECB makes loans at -3% to commercial banks on the strict condition that they make loans to businesses at -2%. Here's my business A. They get a loan for 10 million at -2%. The bank immediately gives them the 200,000 that they won't have to pay back, and then says, okay, we can talk about the remaining 9.8 million, right? If you look like you're going to default, you're not getting the 9.8 million. We just sort of keep it in an escrow account or something. But if you can do something useful with it, we'll give you the 9.8 million as well. But either way, this business just got 200,000 euro in helicopter money. Okay, so I think that that's legal, but again, I would emphasize these guys won't like it. Okay, so but just trying to think outside the box in terms of things that could be done. A last thing, Eurobonds versus ESM. And this has been addressed a couple of times already. Eurobonds already exist. The debt that's issued by EIB, the debt that's issued by ESM is jointly guaranteed by the national governments. There are objections to ESM, and the severity of these objections, as Brigid has outlined, seems a little mysterious, but it seems to partly relate to the conditionality that's involved. But the conditionality is up to the EU to decide what the conditionality is. All the ESM treaty says is that the conditionality needs to be appropriate to the financial instrument used. If, for instance, ESM provided Italy with money that's due back in 50 years' time, I don't think we need to go in and impose all sorts of structural reform related ideas and so on. On the other hand, going to the opposite extreme and saying what we need is a scheme where Europe goes and borrows money and then we give it to countries and they do whatever they want with it. I think that's underestimating the political difficulties, that states like the Netherlands and Germany and the Frugal Four and all of them have. So I think that the ESM is perhaps as good an instrument as we have in terms of if countries do start to feel under stress and they're paying too much in interest in the markets do start to speculate that debt is unsustainable despite all the other stuff that I said. And I think that if what you want is a series of programs that help with recovery and help with getting the economy back on track, I think rather than talking about borrowing and having grants, I think this is better done through the EU budget. And we then think about the normal process for EU spending. The EU, when it spends money, it has committees. The European Parliament analyzes things. There's enormous scrutiny, but as there should be. So I think we can set up a set of programs that are aimed at building back recovery. Those states that are hit hardest will get more of it. In the same way as the common agricultural policy, states that have more agriculture benefit from it more. So I think we can design something within the EU budget that allows states that have been hardest hit to benefit the most, but without getting into this question of grants or corona bonds and so on. Okay, that's all I have to say for now.
Okay, thanks very much, Karl. That's perfect timing. It gives us time now to go through some of the questions that we already have received. And also, if anyone out there has some more questions that they'd like to post, please do so under the Q&A part of the website. Okay, so, excuse me. Karl, could you stop sharing your screen, please? And we'll go to gallery view and we can start our Q&A. So if Aidan and Brigid could unmute themselves as well. Okay, great. Okay, so let's start with the first question that came in. I think this question is directed towards Brigid. And it says, how should the EU respond to the opportunistic policies of Orban in Hungary operating under the cover of the pandemic?
So had I done my last slide, I would have referred to the authoritarians at the table. I think there's no doubt that if the recovery fund is related to the EU budget, you will actually have very strict conditionality in terms of the rule of law associated with it, and rightly. Mm-hmm. He's got away with, but of course, politically, he continues to get cover from the EPP. But I think even the EPP can't justify what's happening in Hungary at the moment. And so I would expect high levels of conditionality attached to rule of law related in the next MFF.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone else have anything to say about that? Nope. Okay. The next question is also addressed to Brigid, just because you were the first speaker. It's from Roland Earn, who actually said he had to leave, so hopefully he's still online. But the question is, you can probably see it there, Brigid, but is it still warranted to say that the EU has no competence in healthcare when the EU's NEG prescriptions has such a devastating effect on healthcare, on the healthcare system?
So firstly, what I was talking about was direct treaty-related competence to do positive stuff. Had I more time, I would have, of course, acknowledged that the indirect effects of other EU governance processes are significant in health, both for good and for ill. So that simply was not possible in the context of the talk, and because the focus was the response to this pandemic from the EU. But of course, the EU governance structures, and particularly within the context of the Growth and Stability Pact, had an impact on funding in the health systems.
Okay, thanks, Brigid. Okay, the next question is to both Brigid and Aidan. So maybe Aidan, we can start with you. And it's from Kieran O'Driscoll from the European Movement Ireland. He says, I fear that the EU public will remember more the lack of EU solidarity in the initial weeks of COVID-19 than any political progress has been achieved since, despite what the Commission has done. What do you think will be the long-term impact of this on the European project from the EU public?
Honest answer, I don't know. I mean, it's a very broad, long-term kind of look into the future, but I think it gets back to that question of framing, and the fact during the Euro crises, the framing, the narrative was very much kind of pitted against this kind of saints and sinners, priests and sinners, and the pigs and the frugals and all these kind of heuristics and acronyms and so on. And I think Brigid mentioned this, it was striking that emerged so quickly, so fast during this particular crisis, despite the fact that this had nothing to do. I mean, if I was in Italy and I was hearing other member states, political leaders, people with real influence, talking about, questions like, well, maybe we should have a look at where they spent their money on and things like this. You can understand why people would be so infuriated. So the question is, why is there such a default position to this type of framing? Where does that come from? And that's an empirical question. And, there's lots of ways you could probe it, but, I'll just put it out there. Maybe it is something particular to the Christian Democrats. Maybe it is something particular to do with the EPP. Maybe it is something particular to do with that cluster of political leaders in that particular grouping. And then the question is, why do they have this default, other people have called it Calvinistic type response, but it just leads to more and more political polarization. And then, so the question, I think the answer to the question, if I have an answer, is that more political polarization makes it much more difficult to reach agreement. And the more you can't reach agreement, the more you have to rely upon the kind of technocratic actors, in this case the ECB, to make the decisions for you. More political polarization, I just don't see as a necessarily good thing. But I'd leave it as an open empirical question. Why this default to these cultural myths and narratives?
Okay, thanks, Aidan. Maybe now we'll move on to a question to Karl, just so everyone has a chance. So Karl, who decides on changing the accounting principles of the ECB, the Governing Council or someone else?
That's a good question. My bet is that each national central bank has its own accounting principles and can probably do it themselves. To give a figure, the Irish Central Bank has revaluation reserves of $6.5 billion, which is actually about equal to the estimated cost of most of the programs that have been set up thus far. I'm being a little facetious about the gold thing. Like the two numbers do line up, but for instance, Irish government, Irish Central Bank is $6.5 billion in this, but they don't own much gold. They have 230 million in gold, but they have other stuff. They would be able to hand over the $6 billion. But it's likely that this would be a decision at Governing Council. Governing Council. It's unlikely the Irish Central Bank would make a decision about how to do its accounting. Like the Euro system has 1 billion committees, right? So there's a committee on fiscal control, financial control, and they would take the decision. I don't think they'll take this decision, but it's not illegal.
Okay.
I don't think.
Okay, thanks, Karl. Maybe we'll go, does anyone else have something to say on that? No? Okay. Well, maybe we'll go back to a question now for Brigid and Aidan. It says, what are the implications of linking the finance of post-COVID-19 economic recovery to the multi-annual EU budget?
Brigid, please.
Well, it's a big question. As you know, the MFF was due to be concluded. The next one starts in 2021. There was an attempt in January to get an agreement on that framework. It didn't work. There was an all-nighter and there was no agreement. Everything has been changed in relation to the MFF by COVID-19. And so the Commission will have to, by the 6th of May, come back with a completely new proposal on the MFF. It'll be very complex. Why? Because already there were very contentious negotiations among the member states, particularly the East-West on cohesion, on rule of law. Obviously, the CAP Supporters Club is still alive and well in Europe. It strikes me that at least for the first 2 years, and von der Leyen said so last night, that they will attempt to get a larger budget, more heft. Merkel has already said that that Germany would be prepared to pay more into the budget. I think what Karl said is absolutely right, in that the budget has well-established processes, there's strong political accountability, and without that you can't get redistribution across member states unless you have appropriate oversight, monitoring and accountability. So I think that it is better to do it via the MFF rather than one more non-off-treaty instrument. But it all really will come down to what the Commission comes up with and then what the member states can agree to. And it's very difficult to predict just what will emerge. I would probably in timing terms look to a European Council at the end of June, or an emergency European Council under the German presidency, which is a very good thing. It's good that Germany has the presidency for the next cycle.
Okay, correct. Sorry.
I do think it's interesting. I mean, my own view is that by linking this to the multi-annual financial framework, you expand out the conversation to the wider EU. So you're bringing in the Eastern, the non-Euro countries into the debate. We don't know what Poland, Hungary, other countries think about this. I think that's slightly problematic because it makes it more difficult then. There is something qualitatively particular to the Euro area that they need to have that conversation about funding, grants, etc., and so on, and the different mechanisms that would take place. By opening it out much further, arguably, you're increasing the number of vetoes and complications.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Okay, thanks. Karl, another more local question for you from Chris Sibley. So how much do you think the government can borrow, spend before we see inflation in Ireland, something that we've effectively avoided for many years?
Yeah, and I don't think that's the big problem right now. Actually, from a geek perspective, the really interesting thing right now is how do you measure inflation when things like restaurants and there's whole, pubs, there's whole sorts of activities for which there are like zero price quotes because it's not happening, and may not be happening for quite some time. I suspect once we sort out all these measurement issues, I suspect you'll probably see we're in for a period of falling prices rather than rising. Excessive government borrowing can stimulate inflation if it's stimulating the economy. So I think if we get to the point where we're worrying about inflation, I would say by then the economy is probably recovered. We can probably be doing less borrowing. There is a question as to whether or not across Europe, because most of our inflation is imported, right? Most of what we buy is imported. We're a small open economy. There is a question about whether or not so much stimulus will end up getting put in place and we have a sort of unexpectedly fast recovery, and then you get this burst of inflation. Lots of people have got their stimulus checks to spend or whatever. That's not a scenario I think that is likely to happen. And the ECB, the ECB would love nothing more than to start raising interest rates, right? So they have there's questions about how much more stimulus they could do in terms of cutting rates, but in terms of going back up, so the ECB is always there to be able to knock the economy on the head with the hammer when the time comes. Now, I personally should be using its 2% target in a sort of symmetric fashion, that having undershot it for many years, that it should now go and overshoot it, or at least try to, and then say we deliver average inflation of 2%. This was going to be one of the big issues in the ECB's strategic policy review that's taking place, which is supposed to be the big exciting thing in monetary policy this year. But I assume the review is still going ahead, and this is something that'll be discussed. But I think it'll be a while before we're worried about inflation.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I think now we'll finish with one more question, because we're kind of running out of time. And this question is actually addressed to all our speakers today. And it says, would you say that the Southern European opposition, especially in Italy, to the eventual deployment of the ESM is justifiable or reasonable? Would anyone like to start?
Well, in my view, it's not. And it's based on a politicization of the ESM at domestic level by a party that didn't know what it was talking about. So I think it's very unwise, faced with a crisis, to cut off any option. But it's now become it's very politicized. Salvini uses the language of virus dictatorship, etc., etc. So no, I think it was, but it is politicized now.
Okay.
I think objection to the ESM conditionality as it worked in other countries is reasonable. And that's what they're assuming. They're assuming that the program is going to say, here's a bunch of money. Now you have to start paying it back very quickly, and targets for your budget deficit to go down and so on. I think the rest of Europe has not signaled strongly enough the nature of the conditionality and that it would be more palatable. And again, a lot of that comes back to this question of, is the debt sustainable? If I'm correct and ECB measures mean the debt is sustainable, then they should be able to receive large amounts of funds and be told, pay it back very slowly over time. And then that presumably will be less unpopular.
Okay.
If I kind of agree with that. I think there's two dimensions to this. It's the legacy of the euro crisis and the legacy of DSM and so on. That's still there. That hasn't been resolved. Those conflicts, those tensions, that lack of trust is still very present. And then on the one hand, as Brigid said, you have political actors domestically politicizing this. But in order to dampen that politicization, it surprised me that nobody in the EU at a senior level came out very publicly and very strongly and said, hey, there will be no conditionalities in the same way we thought about it in the past. Actually, it was an open door. The Dutch were saying, oh no, we need conditionalities. And the tone and the sentiment and the framing of it seemed to appear that those conditionalities were a kind of more penalizing, penancing type approach. That then obviously gave further fuel to Salvini and the Lega and to kind of politicize it even further. But even in between all that, nobody in the Commission came out and said, oh, hang on a second here. We don't think that the ESM will ever have the type of conditionalities. The wording is this, as Karl said, it's very open. The way we envision this, the way we imagine this is providing support effectively without any kind of conditionalities. But that hasn't happened, and therefore it doesn't surprise me that it has been politicized domestically in Italy in the way that it has.
Okay, thanks, Aidan. Well, there's a really interesting question about Brexit, but I fear that if we go there, we're going to be here all day. So we better finish up now before talking about Brexit. Okay, I'd like to end this session by thanking the audience for their questions, but particularly thanking Aidan, Brigid and Karl for their excellent presentations. As I said, it's being recorded and it'll be made available in the next couple of days on publicpolicy.ie. And just to say that we're going to be having one more conference next Friday, 1st of May. So keep an eye out for that. We'll have lots of different sessions as well. So I'd like to end things there. And again, just thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hey, great to see you, Orla.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.